And now we begin the program. A warm welcome to Honorable Madam Vice Chancellor, our esteemed guest Professor Vandana Sonalkar, guest of honor Professor Veena Punacha, senior scholar, and dear participants, I welcome all to the 6th Avabai Wadia Memorial Lecture. We begin the program with the introductory remarks by our Honorable Madam this Vice Chancellor, and now I request Dr. Vatsala to introduce Honorable Madam Vice Chancellor. So over to Vatsala.
Thank you, Putul. It is
very short, desirable,
yes,
Vatsala?
Yes,
very
yes,
short, desirable.
Yes, ma'am. Quickly, I will do. It is indeed a pleasure for me to introduce Honorable Madam Vice Chancellor, Dr. Shashikala Banjari. She is the Vice Chancellor of SNDT Women's University. Her academic approach is a blend of scientific, social, literary, and educational perspectives and insights. As regards her academic excellence, she is an MSc in Biochemistry, MA in English Literature, MAd, and PhD in Education. Professor Banjari has served in different academic and administrative capacities, and she is a member of various professional bodies at national and international level. She has to her credit several research publications. As regards her professional excellence, her dynamic leadership and vision has created an environment for academic growth and excellence in the university. Madam Banjari has signed several MOUs and partnered with reputed national and international institutions to initiate cross-cultural dialogue and strengthen academic and research activities. With the similar objective in mind, during last couple of years, Professor Banjari has headed the academic delegation to Sri Lanka, China, Canada, and Nepal and Singapore earlier. She's been invited to deliver keynote addresses in many international forums. Rooted in the legacy and footprints of our founder, Maharshi Karve, her vision and mission for the university is to encourage, emancipate, and empower women. Being an able and nurturing administrator, Dr. Banjari has always provided support and encouragement to the department and its activities, be it digital archive, organizing conferences, research projects. Recently, her kind contribution and involvement in the documentary film Ardhashakti made by the Center on Women Leadership is noteworthy. I welcome Madam and request you to kindly give your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Vatsala. Very good evening to one and all. Respected speaker, Professor Vandana Sonalkar, our head of the department, Dr. Putul Sathe, then Dr. Vatsala, and our former head and professor, Dr. Veena Punacha, all the esteemed audience and my friends. I am pleased to be a part of this 6th lecture series on Dr. Avabai Wadia. Friends, the relevance of this lecture series is very unique because see, today everywhere in the sphere of education, we are talking about the GER. And when we see what it has contribution in the domain of higher education and primary education as well. And when we are talking or we have discussion, we are having discussion about education, we are much focused on GER. And when we see where are the problems to raise or to increase the GER, and we found that the basic problem of population. India is facing several problems, but the root cause behind it is the population. When I would like to go back and I could see Dr. Avabai's contribution is very unique because she has introduced the concept of family planning in the first 5-year plan. And we are the members of, or we are the stakeholders. We focus on SNDT. We are the responsible members of fraternity. And we have formed the chair, or we can say that Dr. Avabhai Wadia Archives. And it is our prime responsibility to spread light on the contribution of Dr. Avabhai Wadia and her contribution. Definitely, I am very much sure about the speaker, Vandana Madam. Her contribution and will throw light on the women, not only on women, but their contribution. I am highly delighted to focus few points about Dr. Avabhai Wadia. She is the pioneer of reproductive rights of women. She founded the Family Planning Association of India, FPAI, in 1949. After independence, when the Bharat Sarkar had introduced 5-year plan, and Dr. Avabhai Wadia as well honored, introduced his family plan concept in the first 5-year plan, and was honored by the government of India in 1971 with Padma Shri. So we feel proud, or to run the Avabhai Wadia Archives, and especially we are happy when we could see the person like Dr. Vandana Sonalkar, because she is the speaker for today's 6th series. So definitely I hope, or I am very much sure about the thoughts which will be highlighted, or which will be thrown, or which will be given by Madam Sunita, Madam Vandana Sonalkar. And it's a matter of pride to have the people like Veena Punacha, because she is associated with the RCWS, and her contribution is of great use, because till today our head of the department, Dr. Putul, and her team members recall and remember the contribution of Veena Punacha. So with joint association of the people, we could make it possible to spread the thoughts of Dr. Wadia. Thank you, Dr. Putul. And at the same time, my best wishes are with you, because you have taken efforts to bring into light the Dr. Avabhai Wadia's thought through these platforms. So best luck. And I would like to welcome Vandana Madam to speak about the Dr. Avabhai Wadia and her contribution, and people will be highly delighted to listen you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Madam. And now I have the honor of introducing our speaker, our esteemed speaker, Professor Dr. Vandana Sonalkar. Dr. Vandana Sonalkar was the former professor at TISS this Mumbai. She is a well-known feminist writer and translator. She has completed her BA honors from Canterbury and her MA from Canterbury. She has been awarded PhD in economics. Dr. Sonalkar has, to her credit, many national and this international publications in many well-known peer-reviewed journals. She has published widely on the themes of gender and caste, anti-caste movement, and also macroeconomics. In fact, the list is a very long one. It's a very long list. And secondly, the next is, she has also published widely in this Marathi. She has 2 ethnographic studies to her credit. The first one is titled Migrant Communities in the Wahuj Industrial Area near Aurangabad. And the second one is a gender-based benchmark study of employment of persons with disability. Her recent book publications include Why Am I Not a Hindu Woman, which has been published by Zuban. And the second one, which is also published in 2019, is Memoirs of a Dalit, this communist, The Many Worlds of R.B. More, which has been translated from Marathi to English. She has many translations of critical articles, short stories, poems from English into Marathi. The most noteworthy being the translation of the Marathi book, We Also Made History, the book which deals with the role of women in the Ambedkarite movement, a book which we all look up to, and which has also basically, I mean, this has been a very important source of inspiration for all of us. She has also many translations, as I've already mentioned before, from Marathi to English, of short stories, poetry, and critical articles, some of which has been published by Sahitya Akademi. She has also been involved in the development and teaching material on women's studies. She has also contributed richly to the creation of research and teaching material. She has also been involved in the organizing of various refresher courses, workshop, conferences during a tenure as the director at the Tarabai Shinde Women's Studies Center at BAMU. She was the chairperson at the Advanced Center for Women's Studies at TSS Mumbai. She was the member of the advisory committee Women's Studies Center at the University of Pune. Currently, she is a member of the advisory committee of the Women's Studies Center at the Vishwabharati University. She is one of the trustee and founder member of Alochana, which is Center for Documentation and Research on Women at Pune. She was the member of the executive committee of the Indian Association for Women's Studies between 2008 and 11. She has been
re-elected.
Re-elected. Okay. So congratulations, Vandana. Congratulations. Yeah. She has been active in the women's movement, in the left movement, in the anti-caste movement, and also left-wing movement since 1970s. Currently, she is associated with the project on Dalit women MPs and their contribution with the Indian Institute for this Dalit Studies, and currently her ongoing research, which is in the process of writing, is on caste and patriarchy. So with this brief introduction, I request Dr. Vandana Sonalkar to deliver the 6th Dr. Awabai Wadia Memorial Lecture. Welcome, Professor Sonalkar.
Thank you very much. You can hear me?
Can hear
Hello?
you. We can hear you. Yes, we can hear you.
There are some problems with my internet connection, so I'm starting this off on my laptop. If necessary, I will have to switch to my phone, but I hope that won't be necessary. Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be delivering the Awabai Wadia Memorial Lecture this year. Thank you to SNDT University for inviting me. And I'm also grateful to the Vice Chancellor of the University for opening this session. One of the things I want to do in this lecture is to honor the role of Professor Maitri Krishnaraj in setting up the first research center for women's studies in India. This was the start of a long project in which many of us have taken part, pressing for women's studies to be taught in universities, framing course contents, initiating research. A joint endeavor that has always had to struggle for its rightful place in the academy and for freedom to carry out a task which goes beyond the university. Women's studies or gender studies, there is some contestation over the appropriate term, is the academic name for feminist scholarship. The Research Center for Women's Studies in the SNDT University was an early entrant to the field, even globally. I chose my topic for today starting from an important book edited by Maitri Krishnaraj, as I said earlier. As Kamla Ganesh says in her contribution to this book, feminist writing has always distinguished itself from other disciplines by, I quote, openly acknowledging the link between experience and scholarship, and by stating one's methodological and philosophical standpoint. One of the objects of Maitri Krishnaraj in Motherhood, which has the question Glorification Without Empowerment as its subtitle, is to explore the contradiction between the glorification of the mother in Hindu popular culture and the low status of mothers in India. I've just inserted something here. The maternal mortality ratio in India, calculated as the number of maternal deaths per 100,000 live births, has declined to 113 in 2016-18 from 122 in 2015-17 and 130 in 2014-2016, according to the Special Bulletin on Maternal Mortality in India released by the government in July 2020. This compares to the worldwide target of 70 announced as one of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. The Kerala figure is 43. For Assam and Madhya Pradesh, it is near to 200. The maternal mortality rate, like the gender ratio in the overall population, is among the lowest in the world for countries at a similar level of development. The official strategy for lowering the MMR was based on increasing the number of institutional births by persuading persuading women to give birth in hospitals. But healthcare facilities in many parts of the country are still woefully inadequate. The actual conditions in which women give birth, especially in the rural areas, is dismal, at least in some parts of India. But nowhere do they have much say about the decision to have a child or how many children to have. This is brought out in the chapter authored by Divya Pandey, in which she reports the results of her interviews with 40 mothers of different social backgrounds who were treated at a nursing home in a suburb of Mumbai. There is a diversity of experiences of and attitudes to motherhood, but family pressures to conceive a child and to produce male progeny are the norm. Pandey concludes, there is nothing natural about being or becoming a mother. It seems to be one area where utmost familial and cultural manipulation is possible. This is what the reality of motherhood in India is like. But there is a tradition of glorification of motherhood, which is reflected in literature and popular culture. This ideal mother figure sacrifices herself constantly for the sake of her children, her family, and of course, for upholding the prevalent patriarchal norms. Traditionally, she starts her day before anyone else gets up, goes to bed after seeing to their needs, and eats only after the others, and especially the males in the family, have satisfied their hunger. In one of the essays in the Motherhood volume, the writer and critic Shanta Gokhale analyzes the iconic Marathi novel Shamchi Ai by the social reformer Sane Guruji. The author in his life fought for women's education and against discrimination based on caste. The novel is autobiographical and comprises many stories, each with a moral, in which Sham learns many lessons about life from his mother. She is portrayed as a soft, sweet, gentle person, I quote, who when angered can however express herself as violently as anybody else. The setting is a Brahmin family, and the main lessons Sham learns are of kindness, even kindness to those of a lower caste, patience, diligence in doing one's duty, and so on. This novel has become iconic for its portrayal of ideal motherhood and the ideal relation between mother and son. Defying prevalent social norms about masculinity, inviting the criticism of neighbors, Sham helps his mother in her household chores in a chapter titled Ardhanarishwar. Shanta Gokhale points out the device of third-person narration, whereby the author distinguishes himself from Sham. The latter, at one point, declares, Ardhanarishwar is the ultimate goal of mankind. Alone, man is incomplete. Alone, woman too is incomplete. Their coming together completes both. But as Gokhale points out, gender virtues and roles are given and accepted without question in this novel. I have remarked elsewhere that this novel and this Brahmin family have entered popular culture as an ideal for all castes, demonstrating how mainstream literature presents Brahminical lifestyles and values as the norm, when they are in fact unattainable and unsuited to the reality of other caste lives. The figure of the mother sacrificing her needs so that her child, inevitably a son, can attain a better life than what she has seen has also become common in Dalit Bahujan literature. Even in such a setting, where the sacrifices are much greater, writers are rarely aware, especially male writers are rarely aware, that this glorification implies an acceptance of patriarchal norms regarding the mother. There are some exceptions. Baburao Bagul, who in his stories poses the reader with stark ethical questions. Kishore Shantabai Kale, whose empathy with the women in whose sole company he grew up, implicitly questions the patriarchal sensibility. And women writers like Urmila Pawar and Bebitai Kamble. I've referred mainly to Marathi writers with whom I'm familiar. It is the mother-son relation that lends itself to glorification. The mother-daughter relation is much less written about in India, though feminist writers are now venturing into this area. The woman who enters her marital home as a bride gets some status only after she gives birth to a son. This phenomenon of son preference has now resulted in a widespread practice of sex-selective abortions, which has drastically skewed population sex ratios in India, especially for children born after 2000. Earlier, there was an imbalance because of higher mortality rates for females than males in all age groups. Girl children received biased treatment in infancy and childhood. Early marriage and repeated pregnancies affected women in the fertile age group. It is only in the higher age groups that women outnumber men. This itself leads to new problems. I remember being shocked and somewhat disgusted when I offered condolences to a colleague in a former job who had lost his mother in a road accident. His response was to the effect that her children were now grown up and settled, so it was not much of a loss. Religious beliefs, cultural norms, and mental attitudes to the mother and motherhood thus do have material effects. So we can say in answer to Maitri Krishna Raj's question with evidence that glorification of the mother does not lead to empowerment in contemporary Indian society. But this glorification of the mother also has deep cultural and religious roots. To explore them takes us back to ancient India. We have an array, a pantheon of mother goddesses. Much has been written about them, but before we go there, it is worth looking at what Sukumari Bhattacharya has to say in her contribution to motherhood. The tragedy of motherhood in ancient India was its compulsion, which resulted from economic and political forces at work in a society over which women had no control. That motherhood can be a pleasure when the woman chooses it and gets ready for the sufferings of pregnancy and labor in expectation of some measure of joint control by the couple over the child. That a girl child can be as welcome and as gratifying as a boy. That mother is entitled to some honor because she has voluntarily suffered to bring life on earth. These were never experienced by a mother in ancient India. Bhattacharya is talking about ancient India here, but it really applies to other ages and periods as well. The compulsion was not only economic, political, and cultural, right up to well into the 20th century, but biological as well. Marriage or an active sex life inevitably led to childbirth, and childbirth was dangerous for mother and child. Even the 18th century mother of liberal feminism, Mary Wollstonecraft, who defied contemporary norms of sexuality in England of that time, died young in childbirth. The availability of contraception, which gives a woman some degree of choice about whether and when to become a mother, created the possibility of freedom. And as such, it was initially agonized over by the patriarchal guardians of religious morality across the world, in all religions. Abortion was not legalized in many states of the United States until as late as 1973. Birth control and even abortion were, however, recommended to women of the former colonies in the post-colonial world when the former rulers realized around 1960 that the populations of these ex-colonies would expand rapidly as their mortality rates fell following decolonization. In 1963, the already well-known author Mary McCarthy published The Group, a novel about women graduates in the 1930s in the US that spoke frankly about their sex lives, contraception, and even breastfeeding. The novel caused a furore at the time. It was a little later in 1969, when the women's movement had taken off in the Anglo-Saxon world, that a feminist group published Our Bodies, Ourselves, talking about a range of issues including menstruation, contraception and childbirth, female sexual pleasure, and the experience of motherhood. This was a primer and a store of useful information for many women of my generation whose ignorance on these topics was voluminous. 50 years on, women with access to the internet will not be quite so uninformed. I will say here that 2 generations on from what is now called the second wave of the women's movement, and almost 100 years or about 100 years after modern contraceptive techniques became available, the decoupling of sexual activity from reproduction has become a possibility for most women. Incorporating this into our ethical worldview has, however, been more unevenly achieved. Within marriage, still a largely patriarchal institution, the right of a woman to make decisions about motherhood is still very limited in India. The understanding and wider acceptance of human sexuality as being non-binary and complex has led to the expansion of the LGBTQ movements that we see today. Legal recognition of so-called deviant sexual partnerships and individual choices is still a matter of contention. Because this coupling of sexuality or sexual activity and motherhood in a moral framework has still not changed even with the availability of contraceptives. Where same-sex marriages have been legalized, the centrality of the biological mother to parenting is slowly being questioned and challenged in practice. The freedom brought by new reproductive technologies is, however, shaped by deep inequalities of class, caste, and other social divisions. Surrogacy leads to new ways of exploiting the bodies of poor women. In all this, we see a disturbing conjuncture of a widening, tightening, and deepening power of market forces, together with the rise of right-wing populism and religious fundamentalism all over the world. Let us now turn back from the contemporary to the ancient world, to the origin of mother goddesses and the old dispute between patriarchy and matriarchy. Kamala Ganesh in Motherhood brings a lot of clarity to the discussion, pointing out that the matriarchate or matriarchal stage of society, if it ever existed, should not be thought of as a mirror image of patriarchy. Rather, a slightly more equal stage of society, perhaps. From her study of mother goddesses, she concludes that the mother goddess represents, in quotes, I quote her, the abstraction and universalization of motherhood, She was not the mother of particular sons and daughters, nor was she perpetuating a family or lineage, compounding its glory and honor, providing sons for the battlefield or the farm, or saving ancestors from the hellish ignominy of sunlessness and thus incomplete mortuary rituals. She was the creator of life or the cosmos. This is the difference between the mother as glorified in contemporary patriarchal society and the mother goddess who can be traced back to pre-Aryan times. The mother goddess is the Bhumata, the earth mother. We all know the relief figure from Harappa, where a nude female figure is shown with plants sprouting from her spread thighs. Sharad Patil, in his Das Shudranch Gulamgiri, gives central importance to the goddess Niruti, who is associated with the southwestern direction or Nairutya. She is usually considered to be death or destruction personified, the goddess of death or destruction, the regent of the southwestern quarter. This is the dictionary definition. But Patil argues that the purely negative image of Niruti is a later development, that even in the Rigveda, she represents both fecundity and destruction. It is a Brahmanical reordering of the Hindu pantheon that relegates her solely to the sphere of death and corruption. In fact, death and birth are seen as closely associated in a cyclical view of the universe which is very familiar to us. Even today, a house where either a birth or a death has taken place is considered polluting for a prescribed period of time. I do not have the expertise to evaluate Sharad Patil's complicated arguments based on varied textual sources. But his claim that the figure of the mother goddess Niruti, which is related to fertility in nature as well as in human beings, can be traced back to pre-Aryan times is convincing. So also is his evidence for the continuity of a non-Brahminical tradition of worship in which village mother goddesses related to agriculture are still worshipped by what we now call the Dalit Bahujan community. Of course, this does not include those Dalits who have converted to Buddhism. But every village has a Gram Devata with established traditions and often non-Brahmin priests. He also talks about a matriarchate in which a female chief, a queen, or what he calls a Rashtri, has the responsibility of allocating the fruits of the harvest. Engels, in his Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, talks of the overcoming of what is called mother right or Mutterrecht in German as the world historic defeat of the female sex. He associates this with the triumph of the patriarchal family coupled with, oh dear, coupled with the institution of private property, which necessitates control over women's sexuality and reproductive capacity in order to ensure that property passes along the male line of inheritance. Of course, this view has now been challenged even by Marxists like Claude Mayassu, who show that this kind of control over women's sexuality was prevalent even in pastoral societies without settled agriculture or private property. Women are also the source of progeny, and in those times of precarious existence and the struggle to survive, prolific progeny is essential for the survival of the clan. Patil's argument in parallel fashion talks of a Brahminization of the pantheon, which is however resisted by a continuous tradition of worship among the artisanal and laboring castes in which women goddesses are worshipped. Kamla Ganesh in Motherhood tells us of goddesses who earlier stood alone, later becoming consorts of male gods. Again, a process of homogenization within the framework of Brahmanical patriarchy. We have talked of the present and the past in this discussion of motherhood and mother figures. I will conclude by looking at some visions of the future. In this, I am not using statistical projections. Rather, I just consider some imagined dystopias. Because in the world we are living today, a world under the shadow of the pandemic, under the shadow of climate change, uh, dystopias are not difficult to imagine. But they have been imagined for many years of the past as well. Currently airing on Netflix is the serialized screen version of Margaret Atwood's 1985 novel, The Handmaid's Tale. The Handmaid's Tale. Here we have a world, or at least a nation, in which fertility rates have dropped drastically. Now, in fact, uh, recent figures tell us that fertility rates are dropping very fast at present. In this way, this novel was prescient. It was written 30 years ago, more than 35 years ago. But today we do see this overall drop in fertility rates, even in the so-called third world. The few women who remain fertile are forced to provide children to rich childless couples. Mothers are separated from the children they bear and have no rights over them. The authoritarian regime that implements this relies heavily on modified biblical sources and a kind of biblical language of morality, which of course takes its own shape for its own purposes. This is a dystopia based on an extreme religious fundamentalism. There's another serial, Laila, Made in India, which also centers around the drama of a mother separated from her daughter by an authoritarian regime in the society of Aryavarta. The concern of the regime here is not so much to harvest human fecundity as to preserve social distinctions. Both these dystopias bear a striking resemblance to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, published in 1932. 1932 was a time when fascism was close to taking power in Germany. And there was a sense of unease in the air with the Great Depression just a few years ago, and so on. In the Brave New World, here too, childbearing is regimented in order to preserve class distinctions. Mothers are separated from their children, and to speak of one's relation to one's own mother is considered obscene. I end here. I've tried to bring together contemporary attitudes to motherhood, their roots in our past, our mythology, and our religious traditions, and then try to relate them to our imaginings of the future. I've talked about dystopias because I want to convey a sense of disturbance related to the present. But we should also be able to imagine utopias. What should motherhood be like? How should it be seen in the society? And it's not necessary that all women should be mothers. How can we give this biological relationship its proper social place? How can we dream of a better society? And what is the place of motherhood in that society? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Sonalkar. And now I request Vatsala, Dr. Vatsala, to introduce our guest of honor, Professor Veena Punacha. Yeah, Vatsala.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Putul Sathe. And thank you, Professor Sonalkar, for such an engaging and illuminating presentation and highlighting many facets and perspectives on mothers, mother figures, motherhood. And it was really very enlightening. Now I would like to introduce briefly our guest of honor, today's guest of honor, Professor Veena Punacha. Professor Veena Punacha is former director, Research Center for Women's Studies, SNDT Women's University. Indeed, it was under her stewardship that the department has taken an initiative to establish Dr. Ava Bai Wadia Archives for Women 11 years ago in 2009. During the initial years of the Ava journey, Dr. Punacha has taken immense efforts to develop the Women's Archive through conducting several oral history workshops, commissioning research fellowships to senior scholars, conceptualizing and digitalizing the original documents, private papers, letters of Dr. Ava Bai Wadia collated from various institutions like FPAI. Professor Punacha was also an honorary director of the Center for Rural Development. Under this project, she has undertaken several initiatives in Udwara village, Gujarat, and contributed a great deal towards the development of SHGs and Balwadis, women's skill development, legal counseling, and empowerment. She has initiated various teaching courses at the department and has been an inspiration to all women who join the center. Professor Veena Punacha has had a long and distinguished career as an educationist, teacher, and researcher in the interdisciplinary areas of history, sociology, and social anthropology. She has undertaken research across India, particularly in Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Karnataka, including policy-related researches, particularly various minority-related studies, MAVIN projects commissioned by the Minority Department and the State Minorities Commission Maharashtra, and the study on sexual harassment and violence against women for the high-level committee constituted by the Government of India. Her forte is feminist research methodology, oral histories, life histories, participatory action research. She is a prolific writer and constantly writes and is committed to expand and enrich the knowledge of women's studies with her dynamic vision of society. Some of her significant work include Understanding Women's Studies, Childhood That Never Was, an anthology of short stories, Teaching Learning series on feminist research methodology, and edited volumes on oral history, What Feminism Means to Me, Articulating Courage, RCWS Gender Series, etc. Her current project involves an oral history research in which she aims at reconstructing the local history at the Coke district in Karnataka. I now request Professor Veena Punacha to give her concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vatsala Shukla, Dr. Putul Sathe, for inviting me as the guest of honor, Professor Vanzari for the kind remarks you made, and Professor Sonalkar for your very erudite presentation. I'm really happy that you have initiated the discussion with honoring Maitri Krishnaraj's book, Motherhood in India. Professor Krishnaraj, the former director of the RCWS, is a scholar, a humanist of epic proportions. The range and scope of her scholarship spanned interdisciplinary areas of development economics, history, culture, feminist theories, research methods, and more importantly, she was a teacher par excellence and took immense pain in ensuring that others learned from her. She gave opportunities to others. Having worked with her, I can say that her ideas were far ahead of her times. For apart from a contribution to economic theories, she had in the 1980s initiated several theoretical research areas of investigation, some of which was published under the RCWS. These include androgyny, gender in psychology, and of course, motherhood. I would like to, begin with a brief description of the reason and how this book came along. It began with a residential workshop organized by Dr. Maitri Krishnaraj, and at a time on motherhood, as well as those were the days when we were discussing many things about family, motherhood, and a number of publications in women's studies literature have come up at that time on household. What does household mean? What does feminism constitute? And what does the current demographic trends imply in terms of kinship, etc. So at the residential workshop, many scholars came together to discuss the idea of motherhood. The project at that time was to explore the normative construction of motherhood as well as women's lived experiences. Many of these essays were earlier published in the EPW, but many others were not. So when I was the director, we took up the challenge of ensuring the publication of this volume, and it meant a lot of hard work by the research team, especially Usha Lalwani, Milind, and Sapna, for it meant word processing from a scratch and also undertaking and updating the referencing. It was really a labor of love at the RCWS. As Vandana has pointed out, the essays in the volume have articulated many areas of religion, literature, and popular culture. It has indicated the glorification of motherhood and the reification of the mother-child bond through rites and rituals. Does not mean women find the experiences of motherhood very satisfying. It's a profoundly alienating experience under patriarchal structures of family and kinship. This is because the idealization of motherhood coexists with the control over family and kinship over women's reproduction and sexuality. It determines which women give birth, what kind of birth is accepted and what is not. My own article in that book refers to the motherhood practices in a very localized community. It's a historical documentation which indicates how the historical processes of change can impact on the construction of mother role, etc. And there are other fascinating exercises too. And being barren could also be very intimidating to women and frightening to women, for it may mean that she is divorced. And there are many proverbs, folktales, etc., which show that a barren woman could be cast off without any concern over her well-being. Now, as Vandana has pointed out, this kind of Brahminical ideas have percolated down into Dalit attitude and normative structures as well. And she's also pointed out one of the key concerns, which probably was not addressed in the, which definitely was not addressed in that earlier volume, that is on surrogacy. So what she has argued and pointed out, what are the challenges of surrogate motherhood, and particularly with the commercialization of the new sex selective technologies. This key question, where does surrogate motherhood fit into the patriarchal schema of control over reproduction, is the point which needs to be investigated, because it has a great sociological implication as well, because it means where do these, because it means the division between genetic motherhood, reproductive motherhood, biological mother, and also a sociological mother. So can this be very alienating? How alienating can it be? The important point she's making about this particular issue of surrogate mother is within the context of this larger capitalist economy, where very many women find that the only source of income that women do have is perhaps renting their womb. And as many other studies have pointed out, including that of my student, is that rent a womb has become synonymous with the global trade of motherhood. So what does it mean for a child born out of surrogacy with an Indian mother, biological mother, totally alienated from her body and taken away to another country into an alien culture? And also the conditions under which who are the surrogate women? We cannot deny the caste dimension in this particular kind of trend. These are poor Dalit women who have no other source of livelihood in this increasingly capitalist world, but to sell their bodies for surrogacy. And what we also need to consider is what actually happens when these women rent their wombs, because it's they have no control over the number of, because very often they are treated merely as incubators. The women are treated as incubators, and the number of embryos implanted into her may be more than one. But finally, the embryos which are harvested and allowed to live are determined within the commercial transaction on how many children the contracting parents want. So this comes to the question of genetic selections also, in terms of the kind of selective selections that can be made. In my contention, my view, this whole use of the ART technology can also be juxtaposed next to the issue of abortion, the reproductive controls over women and the option of abortion. Now, what we do find is that these are very, very dynamic and sensitive issues played out in the bodies of women. For when we increase, on the one hand, when we increase and allow as a woman's right to have extend the limits to which an abortion is possible, there is an increased danger of sex selective abortions taking place. And on the other hand, when there is a problem of sex selective abortion, legal abortion rights are denied to many women across a broad spectrum. And these women are particularly the poor, the rural women who have very little access to any form of contraception. So to come back to what Vandana has discussed, she's also pointed out this remarkable story, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, in which which presents the way surrogacy perhaps could operate to further alienate women from their bodies and controls over their sexuality as well as reproduction. Because the story which is narrated by Margaret Atwood is that of, it's supposedly in a society, mythical society called Gilead, the Republic of Gilead. Women are divided into pure and chaste wives whose sexuality is controlled, the housekeepers who labor because their productive work is harnessed for the needs of society, and the handmaids whose reproductive capacities is exploited. So the story that is narrated by a handmaid called Offred offers this horrific vision of societies that divide women, force some of them to have children, surrogate mothers, and the others, and also pitilessly eliminate those children seen as disabled children. But the issue of disability is also a contentious issue, which Anita Gai has brought out in this very RCWS forum provided by RCWS. And so it's more a sociological construct, what society wants, rather than an actual pre-given disability, because disabilities are also socially construct. For instance, my own inability or to be able to play badminton may at some point be seen as a disability, justifying my exclusion from society at birth. So the distinction, the point which she has also juxtaposed along with this remarkable story and this remarkable view on a dystopic society is that of The Brave New World, Aldous Huxley's a fabulous book, which again warns of the kind of weeding out of people, babies, how they are segregated, separated, and perhaps created into within a hierarchical ordering of society, training of some babies to become workers and others to head the institution. It's sadly reflective, as Vandana has hinted, of our ancient Brahminical hierarchical Hindu order. Ultimately, this whole context, as Vandana has pointed out, this entire context of the debate has to be seen within this rising fundamentalist approach, as well as the globalization, capitalism with all its rentless, pitiless ways in which it excludes and denies people their right to live. Here, I would like to draw attention to some of the new bills which are being passed within our country, which seems to create a climate that any opposition or different point of view is anti or based on, I mean, this absolutely, the entire possibility, Alex, the entire possibility of this kind of a society is not in the distant future, but in the near future, because as resources get more scarce and agriculture is increasingly becoming unprofitable, the options seem to be to force them into a market economy and control, which would definitely have a negative impact on women. Because when women agricultural workers are excluded from any means of earning a livelihood, they are likely to find that the only survival option for themselves and their children are through surrogacy. I think with these few comments, I should leave the platform open for questions. However, I have one or two questions to add. Perhaps Vandana can shed more light on. One is, of course, how India's place within global capitalism will affect motherhood and the status of women, particularly in the context of surrogacy, and the contradictions which she has also, perhaps she'd like to elaborate the contradictions which she has also pointed out on the exalted status of women in literature and art and the realities of women's lives, because the high maternal mortality indicates the denigration of women as mothers within this political economy. Thank you. But I think before I conclude, I'd like to say a few words on Dr. Avabai Vadia's achievements, because it was because of her that the entire family, as the Vice Chancellor has pointed out, that the entire family planning program was initiated in India, and also draw your attention to the fact that she was representative of the struggle of the first wave feminism in the early 20th century. It was a collective struggle of the first wave 20th century who realized that the freedom of the country did not mean freedom for women unless they could move out of forced motherhood and could have control over their population, over their reproductive labor. But the equally important point is that it is true that at a particular point of time, the family planning movement became coercive and ran into disrepute. But the underlying principle which Dr. Avabai Vadia worked was really to liberate women. Thank you very much.
Professor Sonalkar, we would like you to respond.
Just a moment. Yes.
Yes.
Well, I'll be very brief because I was really talking about this contradiction in the whole of my lecture, and the thing is that the glorification of motherhood which takes place. I thought that the example of Shamji Ai brings it out very well, where it is the qualities of sacrifice and living for others which are glorified, and there is no questioning here of the subordination of women that on which this image of the mother is based. So it's not really surprising that we also find very poor statistics in terms of the population sex ratio or maternal mortality, because ultimately we also have very poor healthcare. The recognition of motherhood, of bearing children and bringing them up as a social contribution, which was recognized in some way by socialist countries and also by the welfare state that we saw after the Second World War. That is completely absent here, and the kind of support given to women by the government health system is also very, very inadequate. And no longer do we think in these terms of childbearing women as making a social contribution and as part of a society which they have the right to shape, so as members of a democratic society, so that they should, the women who bear the physical burden of motherhood should have the largest say in when they accept this motherhood. They should have the right for support from not just their family, but also their state in bearing and bringing up children, because human children are dependent, right up to the age of at least 15 or 16. And this burden should not be borne by one person alone. The glorification of motherhood is the glorification of a person who bears that burden almost solely. So that's where the contradiction exists.
There is one more question for Professor. In fact, two more questions. One is from Bhavya Arora, and her question is, she's saying that how the ancient models living as depicted in the epics have regulated our ideals of motherhood.
Well, that really is a story. Well, in fact, in this book, Motherhood, I think there is a discussion of that to some extent. But, we have many very contradictory examples and very horrifying examples of not only mothers who are separated from their children, in pursuing some higher good, but also there are, in the very beginning of the Mahabharata, we have Ganga, who drowns 7 of her newly born children to free them from a curse. There are very contradictory pictures in the epics. To analyze that is a different kind of exercise altogether. I don't think one kind of picture emerges. What is happening today is, a retelling of the epics in a very patriarchal mode, where the Mahabharata certainly has a much more variegated picture of the relations between men and women, of the role of mothers, and the kind of unions that are possible. The Ramayana is set in a slightly more patriarchal framework, but there are also different versions of the Ramayana. There's not one picture coming from the epics. There is lots of room for interpretation, and I think artists are doing that.
Thank you, madam. There is one more question from Ashwini Patage, and she's asking, just a minute. Yeah, she's asking that in which form goddess Neruti was worshipped?
Well, what Sharad Patil says is that sometimes she's worshipped just in the form of a stone, which is set in an agricultural ground. There is quite a detailed discussion of this, but he does not single her out in that sense when he talks about the continuing tradition of worship of mother goddesses. What he's trying to say is that a non-Brahminical tradition of worship of mother goddesses exists, and references to the goddess Niruti go back right to the Rig Veda and point to the existence of this kind of figure even before the Vedas, in pre-Vedic times. But he does mention that even a shapeless stone can be used to symbolize the mother goddess. But of course, we also have representations of mother goddesses in the sites of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, which are very famous, in fact.
Can I add something to what Vandana is saying?
Yes, please do.
Vandana, what we do find is, because I've undertaken a huge local history project, and yes, there are these, a great deal of mother goddess worship here. These goddesses known as either Bhagwati, or that's the more benign aspect of the goddess, and Bhadrakali, the more virulent aspect of the goddess is worshipped. In the little traditions, these goddesses generally form part of the boundaries around the village. They are boundary goddesses, whereas gods, that is the emanate gods, I'm not talking of the pantheons, they are found deep in the jungles and their role is to protect animals or etc. The mother goddesses require blood sacrifice in a very, very indigenous community mode. Earlier, it used to be human sacrifice. These days, it is a chicken or a goat which is sacrificed, and they have a very interesting way of fooling the gods, fooling the goddess, because they are not offering a human being, but especially Bhadrakali temple requires sacrifices. The other point I want to make is the kind of revivalism which is happening in and among forest indigenous communities who are predominantly agriculturists and originally perhaps at some point hunters. For a very long time, these practices continued. Subsequently, there was this denial of the denial of these customs. And now again, there's a resurgent revival of these kinds of worship, but the worship is in new forms. Many of the older rock-hewn stones representing the goddesses are removed, and a more anthropomorphic image of the goddesses are installed. The main rites are now conducted. Earlier, it was the local communities, different caste groups. I wouldn't use the word caste for indigenous communities. I would see it as jati, which is slightly, when we talk of jati, it's slightly different from caste. Jati groups performing it. And we have the Naivedya, etc., which is conducted by a Brahmin priest now. But yet, the animal sacrifice continues, particularly for goddesses like Mariamma, which is supposedly, the goddess who can curse you with smallpox and other diseases, pandemic kind of diseases. But that is conducted by another indigenous caste group, jati, not caste. And then the point which I'm trying to make here is, within this revivalism has also come back customs which had died out earlier, that is of spirit possession, the goddess possession. So these are some of the interesting observations I've been making currently through my study.
Oh, thank you very much, Veena.
Thank you, Veena ma'am. There is one more question by Dr. Mihir Jyoti, and she's saying that it's very informative session on this basis. And she says that Dr. Vandana Sonalkar reviewed from literature, Shyamachi I and many more. Our culture gave so many importance to motherhood.
Hello.
But the Advanced Center and technology gave a tool to patriarchal society to dominant motherhood from MTP, PNDT, and to the extending emerging surrogacy. Her question is her question is that rate of maternal death increased in the illegal abortions and sex selective process. How feminist movement helped to mothers in this scenario, and is feminist movement help to control maternal mortality?
Well, it's a huge task. I mean, because feminists have critiqued government policy at times and so on, but there has been some questioning of the way in which these campaigns have carried out. I don't think it is within the scope of the women's movement to really reverse the trends or to improve the situation, we can make certain demands of the government. And one of the things which many feminists have been saying is that this institutionalized deliveries and the way in which, you know, ASHA workers now visit households to find out about the condition of a pregnant woman and give her some advice. This is all in a system in which actually healthcare services, state-funded healthcare services have been diminished and their funding has been withdrawn. And, you know, the availability of hospitals for pregnant women in rural areas is, you know, very, very poor. So we can make these demands. There's also, sometimes what is also said is that there are traditional midwives. Institutionalized deliveries are opposed to the activity of midwives. Whereas perhaps these women who are sometimes from Dalit communities, sometimes from others, could be given a certain amount of training because they do have experience in overseeing childbirth. Can they be incorporated into the state system? But this is not the approach that is taken by the government when it's trying to fulfill some kind of a globally determined goal of sustainable development and, you know, reduction of maternal mortality.
Yes, madam. Thank you so much, Dr. Sonalkar. I don't think there are, so far there are no more questions. So as we have come to the last segment of today's Dr. Avabai Wadia Memorial Lecture, on behalf of the RCWS SNDT Women's University, I express my heartfelt gratitude to all eminent speakers on this occasion of 6th Dr. Avabai Wadia Memorial Lecture. And as we commemorate the 107th birth anniversary or the year of Dr. Avabai Wadia, I would like to take this opportunity to record my sincere thanks to Madam Vice Chancellor for her gracious presence and encouraging words on the contribution of Dr. Avabai Wadia on this very special day. I express my profound respect and sincere appreciation to the eminent feminist scholar, Dr. Vandana Sonalkar, for accepting our invite and gracing the occasion with her esteemed presence as a special speaker for 2020 Dr. Avabai Wadia Memorial Lecture and sharing her invaluable insights on motherhood, and mother figures. We truly feel privileged and honored to host and to get an opportunity to listen to such a senior scholar like Dr. Sonalkar, who has brought in multitude of ideas and perspectives from the different intersectional, interdisciplinary, and gendered location. Thank you, Dr. Sonalkar, for highlighting the works of many scholars and writers, right from Maitreyi Krishnaraj, reflecting her work of glorification without empowerment, and that glorification doesn't lead to empowerment. Then work of Divya Pandey, Shanta Gokhale, Babu Rao, Urmila Pawar, traversing from contemporary to ancient, from present to past. She has brilliantly reflected works of Kamala Ganesh, Sharad Patil, and Margaret Atwood. Then the age of Netflix, dystopias, and highlighting many perspectives on mother figures, including the idea of polluting house where birth and death take place, mother-daughter relations, sex selection, religious beliefs, abortion laws, birth control and colonization, critical challenges to legal recognition, to sexual partnership and choices. What should motherhood be like? Thank you, Dr. Sonalkar, for such an engaging and illuminating presentation. I would also like to take this opportunity to express my deep gratitude and appreciation to former RCWS Director, Professor Veena Punacha, for being with us as the guest of honor and sharing her memories and the idea of the evolution of the Awas Center, her views on surrogacy, including how renting the womb, genetic selection, then artificial reproductive technologies, dangers of sex-selective abortions, denial of legal abortion rights, to particularly rural women and women who are in poverty. Then her argument for alienating women's sexuality as well as reproductive rights, bringing in various perspectives from the stories of Atwood, of pure and chaste wives, sexuality, how it is controlled, surrogate motherhoods, the argument for disability rights, reflecting the works of Anita Ghai. Thank you, madam, for being with us. I'm sure getting a chance to listen to such senior scholars was an amazing experience for all of us who are present here today. However, those who could not attend can listen to the recorded video, which will be available on our RCWS YouTube channel shortly. Kindly subscribe to it for updates on the new inventories. Finally, I recognize and appreciate the collective efforts and the technical support provided by the entire RCWS staff under the headship of Dr. Putul Sathe towards organizing this event. Last but not the least, may I take the opportunity to thank our participants, including senior scholars, our friends, colleagues, researchers, activists, and dear students from across disciplinary boundaries who have joined the memorial lecture. And kindly keep visiting RCWS Facebook page for upcoming events. Indeed, it is you who make the events happen. Thank you so much.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Vandana. Thank you, Veena. Hope we can meet soon. Thank you. Thank you, Vatsala. I think, yeah, it was, yeah. Thank you both, Veena and Vandana. Yeah, Veena and Vandana, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.